She was unarmed, outnumbered, and bleeding on the cold floors of a dying space station. But what she did next turned desperation into defiance. Trapped in the middle of an alien invasion, one wounded scientist rewrote the rules of survival using nothing but her mind, her courage, and a spark of madness. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and show some love with a thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's jump into the story. Aurelia Station drifted silently in orbit around Tyros, the massive gas giant swirling beneath it like a painter's fever dream. Most people didn't even know the station existed. It wasn't famous. It wasn't a hub of activity or diplomacy. It was quiet, out of the way, and full of scientists who preferred plants over politics. That's what made it perfect for people like Leora Maeve. She wasn't a soldier or a hero. She studied alien plants. That was her whole thing, cataloging, nurturing, and occasionally arguing with artificial intelligence about proper sunlight calibration for fungus from moons that didn't even have light. That morning, Leora was in the greenhouse wing, gently misting a vine that curled like it had stage fright. Her tablet buzzed once, a system notification. Something about minor power fluctuations, nothing unusual. Stations this old hiccuped all the time. She dismissed it, humming to herself as she moved to the next pod. A second buzz came 10 minutes later. Then a third, louder and accompanied by a low-frequency rumble that made her teeth itch. She frowned and looked around. The greenhouse lights flickered. That wasn't normal. Even during maintenance cycles, the lights never blinked like that. She activated her comms. "Control, this is Botanics 2. Anyone else getting flickers in?" The line cut off with a snap, replaced by static. Leora froze. The only time comms went down was during testing or, well, emergencies. She stood perfectly still for a moment, listening. Somewhere, deep in the station, an alarm began to wail. Not the usual soft, polite beeps of a warning. This was something else. A long, shrill tone designed to punch straight into your nervous system and scream, "Run!" She grabbed her tablet, slid it into her satchel, and bolted out of the greenhouse. In the corridor, red emergency lights had kicked on, painting the metal walls in flashing crimson. Several researchers stumbled past her, wide-eyed, whispering about a breach. A security breach? Here on Aurelia? Who would even care enough to attack a station dedicated to alien crop rotation? She rounded the corner toward the central atrium when the first explosion rocked the station. The force knocked her sideways into the wall. Pain bloomed in her ribs, sharp and immediate. She coughed and forced herself to her feet. Lights shattered above her, casting the corridor into near darkness. The power was failing fast. The emergency. Doors began sealing themselves, thick barriers sliding down with mechanical finality. She knew the layout well enough to understand what that meant. Isolation protocols. The station's automated defense system had detected something it believed could threaten the entire crew. But what? She turned just in time to see the silhouette of something move at the far end of the corridor. Not a person, something larger. And crawling. Leora didn't wait to get a better look. She turned and ran, ignoring the stabbing pain in her side. She had to reach a safe room, or at least the maintenance shaft. There was one nearby, a narrow crawl space that engineers used for emergency power routing. She threw herself toward it just as another explosion lit up the corridor behind her. The shockwave lifted her and slammed her hard onto the grated floor of the shaft. Pain flashed again, her side, her arm, maybe even her ankle this time. She didn't stop to check. She pulled herself inside the shaft and began crawling. It was cramped, hot, and smelled like coolant and dust. Blood dripped steadily from her left side, soaking her shirt. "This is not how I thought my Tuesday would go," she muttered through gritted teeth. The shaft twisted left, then right, leading deeper into the station's lower levels. She heard another sound, now metal on metal. Something was crawling through the shafts. Her breathing quickened. She pushed forward, one elbow after another, dragging herself along the tight corridor. Her satchel bumped her hip with each movement, a constant reminder of the life she'd just left behind, of notes and plant samples, of the harmless world she'd built in this place. That world was gone now, replaced with red lights, blood, and fear. Finally, she reached a small junction box and paused to rest. She couldn't stay here long. Whoever or whatever was on board was looking for something. And if they found her, injured and unarmed, she wouldn't stand a chance. She opened the panel beside her. Inside was a tight access point to the chemical storage bay. Risky, but she knew it was stocked with compounds for biological analysis. Maybe, just maybe, there was something she could use. Not as a weapon, she didn't know how to fight, but something to help her survive. She steeled herself, took one shaky breath, and slid down into the darkness below. The chemical storage bay was darker than Leora expected. Emergency power hummed faintly in the walls, casting a soft blue glow from floor strips that flickered like they were struggling to stay alive. Shelves filled with bottles, vials, and containers stretched down narrow aisles, each labeled with precise handwriting that suddenly felt painfully ordinary for a place now drenched in fear. Leora dropped to the floor with a grunt, wincing as pain flared again in her side. She reached under her coat and felt the sticky warmth of blood. The bleeding had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. That meant she was running out of time. She used her tablet's flashlight, its glow casting shaky shadows on the walls. Her mind raced. What did she have? What could she make? She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't an engineer. She was a scientist. And not even the kind that built things. She grew things. But she had spent years working with volatile compounds, testing how alien plants reacted to different chemical environments. That meant she knew which substances were stable and which ones absolutely were not. She scanned the labels on the shelves. With growing urgency, calcium hypochlorite, nope, toluene. Getting warmer, she whispered, wiping sweat from her brow. Glycerol, potassium permanganate, oh, there you are. She grabbed the 2 bottles and stuffed them into a small utility bag. Her hands shook, partly from blood loss, partly from fear. This wasn't a science project. This was survival. A sharp clatter echoed from somewhere above her. Her head jerked toward the sound. Someone was in the ventilation system. They were getting closer. She cursed under her breath and ducked behind a tall shelf. In the quiet, she could hear her heartbeat pounding like a drum in her ears. She had maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. Leora began mixing the compounds, carefully, deliberately. She wasn't trying to create an explosion, not exactly. She needed something that would create chaos, a distraction. The Ulreks, whatever they were, had been methodical, cold, tactical, but they were still organic. She had dissected stranger creatures during her studies. If they had lungs or membranes or any kind of breathing system, she could use that against them. The mix began to fizz, a soft bubbling sound that reminded her, absurdly, of baking soda. Volcanoes from childhood science fairs. Except this one wasn't going to win a ribbon. It was going to make someone suffer, hopefully not her. She poured the chemical slurry into a containment pod and sealed it tight. It was meant to hold sensitive spores, but it would work for this. She rigged a simple trigger using pressure, valves from a broken oxygen unit, and taped it all together with emergency patch tape. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't safe. But it was something. Another sound, this one much closer. Heavy footsteps now, crunching glass and metal, moving slowly, like a predator that already knew it had cornered its prey. Leora's mouth went dry. She stood up, her legs wobbling beneath her. Her hands were smeared with blood and chemical residue. She probably looked like a ghost. But ghosts didn't bleed, and she was doing plenty of that. The door to the bay creaked open, A shadow filled the entry, tall, angular, and wrong in ways she couldn't explain. The Ulrex warrior stepped inside, its head twitching left and right like it was listening. Its eyes glowed faintly. Leora's translator had failed earlier, but she didn't need to understand the words. The message was clear: surrender or die. She stepped out from behind the shelf, holding the pod to her chest like a child with a secret. "Hey," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "You're looking for me, right? Congratulations. You found me." The Ulrex raised its weapon, an ugly, jagged thing that hummed with energy. Leora took one slow breath. "I'm just a botanist," she said, smiling grimly. "But even I know that sometimes nature fights back." She threw the pod. It hit the ground and cracked open. A thick, hissing vapor burst out and filled the room with a cloud of biting chemical fog. For a second, nothing happened. Then the Ulrex gave a sharp, unnatural cry. Its weapon clattered to the floor as it clutched at the sides of its head. Behind it, more footsteps came. 2 more shadows entered the room. Then they too were choking, stumbling, claws scraping the walls. Leora didn't wait. She ran. Her side screamed in pain, but she pushed forward, barreling through the smoke, past the disoriented Ulrex and into the hallway beyond. Her lungs burned from the fumes, her vision blurred, but adrenaline kept her going. Behind her, she could hear chaos shouting, coughing, panic. It was working. Her trap wasn't lethal, but it had bought her time. She ran down the corridor, each step a thunderclap in her skull. She didn't know where she was going yet. She just knew she had to keep moving. She passed broken panels, sparking wires, the ruins of her safe, quiet world. Somewhere ahead was the hydrofarming sector. Maybe she could hide there. Maybe she could turn the station itself into her weapon. As she rounded the corner and slammed her shoulder against a jammed door to pry it open, she muttered to herself, "You wanted to study life on other planets. Leora, welcome to the practical exam." The hydrofarming wing had always been Leora's favorite part of the station. It was warm, alive, and full of quiet green things that didn't ask for much except light, water, and time. Now as she squeezed through the half-collapsed entrance with blood on her clothes and fire in her lungs, it felt like stepping into a memory wrapped in danger. The scent of moist soil, plant nutrients, and artificial sunlight filled the air. The fan still buzzed, the irrigation lines still dripped, and the overhead grow lights hummed as if they didn't realize the station was under attack. Lior leaned against a support beam, gasping for breath. Her vision blurred at the edges. The chemical cloud had affected her too. She wiped her face with a shaky hand and forced herself upright. There was no time to rest. The Ulrex were still coming, and this time they wouldn't underestimate her. They would come faster, smarter, more carefully. She had used surprise once. She wouldn't get that advantage again. She moved deeper into the hydroponics wing, navigating rows of hanging plants, nutrient tanks, and mist sprayers. The layout was second nature to her. She had designed most of it. That gave her one small edge. This was her domain. And if she couldn't fight the Ulrex with weapons, maybe she could fight them with the environment itself. Leora stumbled to the control panel. The interface flickered with warnings, but the core systems were still online. She bypassed the safety protocols with a few shaky commands and began rerouting the environmental controls. She increased the humidity, spiked the temperature, and cut oxygen flow in small specific zones. Her goal wasn't destruction, it was confusion. She wanted the space to become uncomfortable, unfamiliar, maybe even dangerous, at least for the Ulrex. Her body screamed at her to stop. Her wound throbbed. Her hands were stained with dried blood and dirt, but she kept moving. She knew the Ulrex didn't wear traditional breathing masks they had. Organic systems, maybe even filters built into their bodies. But their biology couldn't handle drastic changes in atmosphere. She remembered one of her dissections, something about moisture sensitivity in their inner lungs. This was a gamble, like everything else, but she had no better options. A noise echoed behind her, distant, but getting closer. Claws scraping metal. The soft crunch of something sharp against the floor. They were in the wing now. Leora ducked behind a nutrient tank, crawling through a tangle of vines and sensor wires. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. Her side was wet again. The bleeding had returned. She spotted a series of pressure pipes running overhead. They delivered nutrients through the entire greenhouse system built for speed and volume. More importantly, they were under high pressure. If she could reroute the flow and overload a few of the lines, the pipes might rupture, hot, chemical-laced liquid spraying everywhere. It wouldn't kill, but it could blind, scald, or at least buy her another minute. She pulled herself up with one arm and began adjusting the flow regulators. Her fingers slipped and a knob snapped off in her hand. "Of course," she muttered, tossing it aside and improvising with manual valves. Below, she saw shadows moving between the rows of crops, dark, sleek, and silent. At least 4 of them. They moved like hunters, like they didn't expect to leave without finishing what they started. She waited until the first one was directly beneath a distribution node. Then she released the pressure. With a loud crack, the pipe burst open, spraying steaming liquid in a wide arc. The Ulrex shrieked, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the bay. It fell backward, clawing at its face. Leora didn't wait. She triggered 2 more nodes, flooding the area with vapor and heat. The humid air turned into a choking cloud of steam and chemicals. Her vision swam, and her legs nearly gave out. But she ran. The noise behind her was chaos, panicked movement, snarling voices, broken equipment crashing to the ground. She darted through the rows, heading toward the secondary exit, an emergency hatch she had used once during a system test. If it still worked, it would lead her toward the station's power control center. She needed to get there. She had one more idea. One final wild idea that might be enough to stop the Ulrex for good. The hatch was stuck. Of course it was. She jammed her fingers under the edge and pulled. It didn't budge. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer again. She punched the manual override. The hatch hissed, groaned, and finally slid open, just enough for her to squeeze through. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel them behind her, getting closer, more determined than ever. Leora dropped into the next corridor and slammed the hatch closed. Her hands trembled as she locked it down. A few seconds of breathing room, that's all she had. She pressed her back to the wall, slid down to the floor, and laughed softly, not out of joy, not even relief. Just the strange, tired laugh of someone who realized she had survived again. Somehow with nothing but blood, plants, and blind hope. But it wasn't over. The power control center was only a few turns away. If she could get there, if the systems were still functional, she had one more move left, one spark. That's all it would take. The corridor leading to the power control center was quiet in a way that didn't feel safe. It felt like the pause before a final blow. Leora moved as fast as her injured body allowed, clutching her side, her steps unsteady. Her shirt was soaked with blood, her breath short, but she kept going. The only sound was her boots hitting the floor and the occasional flicker of failing lights overhead. She had no time left for fear. The Ulrex were behind her, and they wouldn't stop. She had hurt them. She had outsmarted them. Now they would come for her with everything they had. The door to the power control center stood ahead like a final challenge. She keyed in the override code she'd memorized from training drills she'd once found pointless. To her surprise, the door opened. Without protest. Inside, the room was a maze of conduits, energy coils, and consoles flashing warning signals. The air was warmer here, charged with static. Leora could feel the tension in the walls, like the station itself was holding its breath. She staggered to the main control panel. It took her a moment to focus her eyes. Every display was blinking red. Systems offline. Energy rerouted. Warnings stacked on top of one another. But one core system was still active, the electromagnetic field generator. It had been installed to protect sensitive data equipment from solar radiation. But if she amplified the energy and directed it across key channels, it might disrupt the Ulrech's weapons. Their tech relied on crystalline cores, delicate and precise. A strong enough electromagnetic burst would scramble them temporarily. If she was lucky, she worked quickly, ignoring the shaking in her hands. Each key press took effort. She bypassed safety protocols, redirected backup power, and forced open systems that weren't meant to work together. Sparks flew from a nearby panel. The station didn't like what she was doing. Frankly, neither did she. But this wasn't about safe science anymore. This was survival. The door behind her shuddered. They had found her. She could hear the heavy scrape of their claws and the low clicking sounds they made to communicate. Leora swallowed hard and kept working. One final sequence remained. One command to send the energy surge through the station's core. She hovered her hand over the button. The door burst open with a crash. 3 Ulrechs entered, weapons raised. Leora turned slowly to face them, every muscle in her body aching. She stood with her back to the console, hair damp with sweat, blood running down her arm. She looked nothing like a threat. But her eyes were sharp, burning with something far more dangerous than anger. Determination. The lead Ulrech stepped forward, speaking in its rough, rattling voice. Leora's translator, damaged and slow, barely caught the meaning. Surrender. Final warning. She shook her head. "You've made a mistake," she said quietly. "You thought I was just a scientist. But science doesn't just study the world, it changes it." Then she pressed the button. The room lit up in a blinding flash. The electromagnetic field surged with power, slamming through the circuits and into every system connected to the network. The Ulrech's weapons sparked and exploded, dropping from their claws. The creatures staggered, disoriented. But Leora's plan had one flaw. The energy didn't stop at their weapons. It kept spreading. Consoles burst. Lights shattered. The artificial gravity wavered, lifting her briefly off the floor before slamming her back down with bone-jarring force. Leora cried out, but forced herself to move. The Ulrechs were recovering faster than she'd hoped. Disarmed, yes, but still dangerous. They advanced on her, claws raised, their bodies built for combat. She backed away, slipping on the slick floor, her vision dimming. Her plan had failed. She hadn't stopped them. She'd only slowed them down. Then something unexpected happened. The fire suppression system activated. A high-pressure hiss filled the room as white gas poured in from the vents. The emergency system was triggered by overheating, one of the fail-safes she'd ignored. She hadn't planned for it, but it was happening. The gas wasn't harmful to humans. But the Ulrechs weren't human. The nearest one inhaled sharply, then staggered, coughing and clawing at its own throat. The others followed, twisting and stumbling, their movements wild and panicked. The gas wasn't lethal, but it was enough to incapacitate them. Their breathing systems weren't built for Earth-based chemicals. Leora didn't wait to watch them fall. She crawled past them, barely holding herself upright. Her mind screamed for her to rest, to collapse. But she kept going, dragging her body through the corridor, toward one final destination, the communication hub. It was, somehow, still intact. The door opened with a quiet hiss, and she stumbled inside. The room was small, lined with transmission arrays and backup terminals. She dropped into the operator's chair and slammed her fist on the emergency beacon. The signal flared to life. A pulse of data sent across quantum channels. Not just a distress call. Her research files were encoded in the packet. Everything the Ulreks had come to steal now, sent to every major outpost in the Commonwealth. Her eyes blurred. She slumped back in the chair, pain crashing over her in waves. Voices crackled in the air, real human voices. A squad of peacekeepers burst through the entrance moments later, weapons drawn. One of them dropped to her side, pulling off their helmet. "We got you," the officer said. "You're safe." Leora tried to smile, but her body was too tired. Everything went quiet. 2 weeks later, she stood before the Science Council, her wounds healing, her story already spreading across the stars. She had survived, not because she was strong, not because she was trained, but because she refused to give up. They had come for her research. They had tried to silence her, but she had fought back with nothing but her brain, her courage, and the spark of something more. Hope.